Our conversation today is with Blockstream's Director of Marketing, Fernando Nikolić. Fernando has an interesting backstory, having emigrated from Argentina to Norway and then having spent time in both North America and Europe. In today's talk, we discuss the challenges of communicating Bitcoin, the importance of integrity, his firsthand experience with hyperinflation, how Bitcoin and Tether are viewed outside of the US, and how liquid could be a big part of the financial future. This was a really fun conversation. If you find it useful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Fernando, thanks for doing this today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, so to set the stage a bit for today's conversation, maybe you can give us a quick introduction to who you are and what your role is at Blockstream.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the marketing director at Blockstream. What I do, I basically oversee all marketing activities related to our products at Blockstream. And discovered Bitcoin back in 2016. Went through the first that craze running up to the end of 2017, and I think I needed a little bit of the hype to die down in 2018 to really understand Bitcoin the way that I felt I was comfortable with. But coming from Argentina, the things that appealed to me the most with Bitcoin was the predictable money issuance, the hard cap, just the monetary properties about it. So that's pretty much my Bitcoin journey.
So marketing, Bitcoin in general and kind of a Bitcoin focused company specifically, especially one like Blockstream, where I think a lot of our efforts are focused on applications that I think are probably a step or two ahead of where the mass market is. What kind of challenges do you find you kind of bump into with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few challenges to choose from. I think the main ones would be, if you are in marketing and you have, for example, a product that already exists, that already has an established product market fit. Let's say you're running marketing for an accounting software. You have a huge total addressable market who probably have some experience using some other software similar to yours. You have probably industry benchmarks, standards that you can measure your own performance with, stuff like that. In Bitcoin, you don't have anything like that. It's so early still that you're pretty much doing a lot of uncharted territory as you do the marketing. So when we're so early in the mass adoption phase of Bitcoin, I think one of the main challenges of doing marketing, not only for Blockstream but for any other Bitcoin only or Bitcoin focused company, is you have to consider the educational part of your marketing the product. So you have to be part of that individual that belongs to your specific target audience. You need to be part of the educational journey of grokking Bitcoin to a certain level so that this person is comfortable enough to start buying Bitcoin. And then maybe, after doing the custodial thing on an exchange for a while, have enough confidence and enough know-how to take their coins to a wallet. And then if you're a wallet provider, which that's one of our products, we should be there ready to kind of welcome that person in. So the challenges and the question that we at Blockstream need to ask ourselves is, how early in that educational process do we want to be in? And personally, I think we should be as early as possible, because if we are able to educate through our products, through showcasing the different features, the different benefits, then when the time is right and that person is ready to, let's say, download Green and start using it, the loyalty that we're going to see from that person is kind of undeniable. It's going to take a lot for that person to go somewhere else. If the experience from the very beginning stages of understanding Bitcoin to actually using a product, if that whole journey is perfect, then I think we've done our job. And it's a challenge because it's Bitcoin, right? It's kind of like trying to market a car in a time where people were riding buggies and horse and carriage. You need to kind of take those people and convince them about this new technology that is way superior. But there's a lot of years and a lot of unlearning that people have to do to understand the real benefit. So it's challenging, it's fun, it's super rewarding, and I think a lot of people who do marketing in the Bitcoin industry, I think they appreciate the challenge.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing because one of the key kind of ideas in Bitcoin is to minimize trust, to be your own bank, kind of personal sovereignty type of thing. But it's also an industry that's evolving really, really quickly. And you get each wave of adoption as you go up that adoption curve, you get a lot of new people in. So, integrity and kind of brand integrity, I think, is probably really important because you need to, strangely enough, kind of like counterintuitively, rely on people, I think, in a way to kind of brands and companies and individuals to help you with the analysis, I think, and understanding Bitcoin a little bit. So I think probably managing your brand is a very important thing, probably more important than other industries, I would guess.
Definitely, and it's also interesting because there's a lot of people who look at, for example, Ethereum or other altcoins, and they say, oh, their marketing is like so much better and we should do this, we should do that. But there's a big difference when you lie and you overpromise stuff that you will never be able to actually fulfill, versus having that integrity that you're talking about and being true to also your limitations, and like not overpromise stuff that won't see the light of day in I don't know how long. These um, people in Ethereum and all these other scammers, they're great at just like saying whatever they need to say just to make you feel good.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that has a great emotional effect. And the response to those type of campaigns is very fast, very effective, but it's extremely short lived. So if you want to be in the game for a while, and Blockstream has been here since 2014, right? And people that are part of Blockstream even before 2014 when it comes to Bitcoin, integrity, telling the truth, and just be solid in your communication and your positioning. That's everything. If you break that, then it's like a free for all, and it's like anything can happen, and you can say whatever you want to say just to earn some money within a certain quarter, or whatever, like very short term goals that you might have. So it's a big difference, I think, and
yeah.
yeah, integrity is completely an important part.
Yeah, I think it comes out over time too, right? Like there's that really great kind of graphic that shows the top 5 or 10 coins by market cap every year going back, and then they just all kind of change, but Bitcoin's always at the top. I always think that's a really good one.
These waves, they come and go, and the reason why Bitcoin is at the top is because the underlying benefit of Bitcoin is just an evergreen thing. It's like fixing the money, right? So we will always come back to these extreme situations where the money needs to be fixed and we need to see money in a UI. And I think Bitcoin always comes back whenever there's like a hyperinflationary situation in a country, or even in the US, what's happening in the US and the Western world right now. Bitcoin always manages to come back and be super relevant as the best alternative to fix whatever problem is, or that we're going through as a society.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think that's starting to pay off, right? So, like, if you look at the theme of 2021, I think was institutional adoption, and we've just saw this complete change in attitude towards Bitcoin from institutional investors, and I think that's obviously carrying through into this year, and probably maybe 2022. If you have to guess, would probably be about sovereign adoption this year. So I think there's been a big change in people's attitudes from that perspective, but it feels like the media is really stuck in their ways and has been slow to change. And I think notoriously, probably like big business platforms like Bloomberg and FT, I think it's pretty well known that they have a fairly strong anti-Bitcoin stance. Do you think that's kind of characteristic of the media, the large media platforms in general, that they're typically anti-Bitcoin, and why is that? And is it changing? And does it even matter given that we now have alternative media titans like the Blockstream Talk podcast?
I love this question. I mean, talking about the media and the press and the MSM specifically is always interesting because I see them as this reactionary machine who kind of just reacts to just sentiment that's like just they feed off external factors and kind of like do a spin-off that promotes whatever stance that they have chosen to take already. And that stance that they have chosen to take is probably very much influenced by shareholders or political alliances that they have. So I think that the way the tide has kind of like changed lately is because of private companies and private like institutional investors like the PTJs, the Druckenmillers of the world. They come out and speak favorable about Bitcoin, and that's a reactionary force that the press can't really ignore, right? So it's about the pressure that you apply. So there's a lot of political pressure, there's a lot of shareholder pressure to create different like negative stories about Bitcoin. But when the pressure comes from the people, or at least to begin with right now, the institutions and like the famous investors, then it's just too big to deny, and they have to kind of like cover it favorably. But I think they are, defending the status quo for the most part, and obviously their incentives lie very strongly in talking trash about Bitcoin. But I think as clown world intensifies, there's going to be an undeniable surge where Bitcoin is just will prevail as like a positive news to cover.
I think there's also a lot of saltiness with these reporters. I think there's people that have been covering Bitcoin since 2014 and have been telling people why it's stupid to buy it since like $140. It's probably a bit painful.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you were asking like, does this even matter? And I think the fact that we can probably look into, we can take a reporter and we can do a Twitter advanced search and just go, search for Bitcoin and then
Yes.
just scroll to like 2014, 15, and we'll see like they totally knew about Bitcoin. They just chose for whatever reason not to get involved. And we have social media, and that is a good kind of like a way to challenge the MSM a little bit. So, I think they don't matter as much as they maybe did 10, 15 years ago, even though social media is another like entirely different beast. But I think just the free flow of information has, minimized the real influence the mainstream media has over any narrative, including Bitcoin.
What parts of communicating the Blockstream and the Bitcoin story do you find are maybe the hardest, or maybe that people tend to misunderstand the most?
And so you have um, two things in my opinion. As a marketer, I like to think about these things. So this might be a little bit esoteric, but let's try. Um, you have an unconscious bias and a conscious bias that kind of like fights within your mind with everything that you consider. So you read about certain things, and you have the conscious bias and the unconscious bias kind of like affecting your judgment. And I think the media and the press, they are very good at influencing the conscious bias that you have. So, in a bear market or something negative happens, you see the media. It's fuel for the media, and they will cover something negatively. And somebody who is a little bit skeptic about Bitcoin just because they don't know too much, they will read something like that, and it will affect their conscious biases. And then the more FUD, you see the same FUD arguments being recycled over and over from the media. That affects the conscious bias of somebody who's already a Bitcoin skeptic, because they see, oh, the same FUD comes back, so therefore it has a deeper meaning, and therefore it might be true, just because more and more people are repeating the same arguments, right? But then you have the unconscious bias, which is kind of like the years and years of being in the educational system, where you are being taught and you're being indoctrinated to think that money should be something that the government should control. And these are like years and years of indoctrination that you have to unlearn as an adult. And it takes a lot of time to kind of like break down those mental barriers. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to just Bitcoin in general. And I think marketing is actually the channel to mitigate all of that. But it takes time and a lot of effort. But I think knowing who might be a skeptic, who might be on the fence, and then trying to understand what are the things that this person is trying to achieve, what are this person's goal, and then talking about certain benefits that our products have that can solve those issues, or handle those objections, or just help this person achieve their goal. I think making that connection is a way more powerful end result than any FUD article being distributed by the media. But it's hard. I think a lot of misunderstanding related to Bitcoin comes from the unconscious and the conscious biases that are being made.
It has to be easier now, though. Like, I mean, that has to be changing because, I mean, even just a couple of years ago, investing in Bitcoin was a pretty wild idea, right? Like, you would talk to people about it and they would laugh it off completely. Like, I pitched it at my old job in the bank in 2016, the idea of a GBTC type fund in Asia. And I got laughed at, like literally laughed out of the room. And the guy said, I'm not going to put my name against it. There's no way. Right. And that's clearly changed now. Now everybody's clamoring to kind of get involved. And I don't think anybody would think it's ridiculous. You can argue about, how much of your portfolio you want to invest. And I think that's a reasonable argument to have. But although a lot of Bitcoiners would say, 110%, right? Like, why do you still have furniture?
Yeah, no, totally.
It's got to be easier now than it has been in the past, right?
It is kind of like that meme of that dude who's like dancing alone in the festival, and then it takes a minute or two, and then more and more people join, and at the end everybody's dancing. So you would be surprised, like me being from South America, the same FUD that you read about in the Western press, you also get exposed to in South America. And you would think, oh, you live in a country that experiences a lot of hyperinflationary dumpster fires. Bitcoin should be such a no-brainer to you. And people still believe in the FUD that Western media, and which the South American mainstream media translates and kind of like distributes regionally. So it's a slow-moving train. I think we're on the right path, though, but it's a slow one for sure.
I'm really interested in how Bitcoin is used and perceived in different parts of the world, because I've noticed for sure that in Asia it's probably seen a little bit differently than I think it is in probably North America. So, you're back in Europe now. Previously, you were based in Canada. You have family, you just mentioned, in Latin America and places like that. You speak English, Spanish, Norwegian. From your perspective as an international man of mystery, how do you see the differences between how Bitcoin is used in some of these different parts of the world, maybe Latin America versus the United States, for example?
I'm super grateful. Like, even though I don't feel like I have a country that I think I belong to, or like, my family, even my family is like distributed across the world. I've always felt that it's always been an advantage for me, because then I am able to be more empathetic to, the plights of different people. And I also have a way to maybe understand different cultures a little bit quicker, perhaps. And I've also traveled a lot, just like apart from the family ties that I have as well. So I've known quite different cultures by living in those areas myself. And before Bitcoin, I always thought that was an advantage just in general. But and put it into Bitcoin perspective, it's an extremely valuable tool that I use, because even though I see that there are, like, different ways that governments are doing different things, like I mentioned before, the FUD that you see in the Western media is still being distributed in these regions. But at the same time, you have these, like, I'm from Argentina. So in Argentina, you have capital controls, and just, every decade, like a hyperinflationary dumpster fire happening, like on a regular. It's a chronic disease at this point, right? And the government is defaulting their debts, and they need to rebalance every 7 years, every 8 years, with every mandate almost. And I think as a result of that, the citizens have been more, street smart, and they don't believe what the government tells them, even though still there's, considerable amount of people who do. And but the thing that is really cool to observe is just how far the human imagination can actually go in order to escape all these capital controls, and just like the incredibly bad precedent that you have just by being born in a place like Argentina and trying to trying to reach for a middle class life. Um, it's very different, and I think when Alex Gladstein wrote his article about, like, check your financial privilege, I think it opened a lot of eyes for a lot of people in the Western world, to kind of like what the situation is for people outside of the West. And I think it's necessary. I'm super bullish on Bitcoin adoption outside of the US, to be honest. I really don't care about Western countries. I really see such a use case for Latin America, for Africa, for Asia. And I really love the fact that they naturally just gravitate toward not only Bitcoin, but stablecoins as well. And it's difference in attitude that just comes naturally from just being surrounded by bad government. And I love to see that, because I don't like governments at all. So it makes me happy to see that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. All the really exciting stuff in Bitcoin is happening kind of outside, mostly I guess outside the Western world, right? Like in places like El Salvador, and banking the unbanked is such like a venture capital meme. Like it's almost ridiculous to say, but it's so interesting to see El Salvador actually turning to Bitcoin as a solution to that problem. And then you think about, and then you look at, I think it was Chainalysis in their 2021 report. They said where Bitcoin is being used the most, And it's places like, Africa, where people can't get access to banking, but they have mobile phones. I mean,
Mhm.
that's phenomenally interesting.
Yeah, I think there was a considerable lower class of in India that pretty much rose from extreme poverty to somewhat livable situation just through smartphones. Like just the fact that you can, and this is like even before Bitcoin, right? Like we're talking early odds, first decade of the 2000s. Just the fact that you can do commerce over smartphones, and people can just like set up a shop in a corner and get paid using the phones by other people using their phones. That is like an opportunity bigger than any government can hand you out in any like social plan or any whatever welfare state that you can ask for. uh, just technology in itself has enabled so many people to come out of like extreme poverty to a somewhat respectable life that Bitcoin is just an extension of that trend already. So I really think that apart from being able to just do commerce and kind of like you open yourself up to the world by just plugging into the Bitcoin protocol, I think it's also changing a little bit of the mindset of people, because when you live in countries like Argentina or Venezuela that sees extreme hyperinflation, you are being taught not to save. You're being told to like, you better use all the money that you have the day you get paid to get the groceries and get everything that you need, right? Like there are people, you come back the day after buying milk, and milk might be 25% more expensive. So the essence of saving for long term for future prospect is just out the window. And the fact that with Bitcoin you can kind of like instill that way of thinking apart from opening to the world and like accepting, doing commerce, but also the savings part of it is so extremely sustainable and healthy that it's just a revolution in how people from Latin America, Africa, and Asia can actually just plug into a protocol and change their life literally. So yeah, I love it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I've always thought about that too, how Bitcoin flips the time value of money on its head, right? Where you've got this asset that you're pretty confident is going to go up in value over time, and you need a house, and you've just really got to think about like, do I want to convert Bitcoin and buy a house or something like that? So it really, it's like you said, it's sustainable. It's kind of more environmentally kind of positive because it really decreases your tendency to consume.
Yeah, totally. And that is also something that you in a hyper Bitcoinized future where you really need to be convinced to part with your Bitcoin when doing a purchase. You that thing that you exchange your Bitcoin for has to be so much more valuable to you than the Bitcoin that you have to release, that it puts pressure back on the producers and just the providers of services and products in general. These products need to be so damn good that it is worth more to you than the sets that you are willing to release. That sets the bar for the future of just manufacturing in general.
So what about Tether? Like I've noticed also that there's a big difference in attitude kind of between regions on Tether and also obviously within Blockstream as well. So, especially in places like kind of like, China or I presume Argentina, right? Where capital controls are kind of the strictest. It's a really good way to kind of like handle that stuff. So have you seen a difference in attitudes on Tether as well?
Yeah, I have, and I think in Argentina specifically, the capital controls are ridiculous, right? You are allowed to exchange Argentinian peso to US dollar every month. I think the limit is $200 now, and it's always been the case. Like Argentinians have always flocked to the US dollar. We have a proximity to the US just by being in the same continent, but it's also like, we always looked more to the US rather than to Europe, even though we are European descendants for the most part.
Makes sense in terms of distance and proximity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the US dollar has always been highly attractive asset just to hold. And hyperinflation is not a new phenomenon in Argentina. The country has every decade since the 40s have experienced this. So this is like ingrained in people's just brains at this point. And when things get really bad, just you see capital flights even outside of Argentina just disappear. And these capital controls that the government puts as a as a response is extremely non-productive. So people, they are, again, with the human imagination of how like far it can go in order to circumvent these things, they have set up something called caves, in Spanish called cuevas, which is like underground exchange houses where you can go with how many pesos that you want and exchange it to actual physical US dollars. But the last 4 or 5 years, it was like explosion in stablecoin adoption by these underground exchange houses, these so-called cuevas, and they offer Tether as and it's unlimited, right? So if you have you go get your official $200 cash through the public means, but then if you want to have 600 every month additional that you want to have in US dollars, you go to Tether. So it has been extremely interesting to see the adoption and the use cases for Tether in places like Argentina. It's extremely positive. I'm super happy to see that. And because ultimately what it does to people is that they preserve the value of their time and labor. And that is like the most crucial thing that you have to have for people in the society. So I'm extremely happy to see that.
Yeah, it's really interesting how most of the usage of Tether is outside of the US and then most of the criticism comes from the US. That's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, again, these are like mainstream media narratives, that people just like to hop on, because if you already have a negative attitude about something, it's very easy to just jump on that train and think that you have arguments that kind of like dunks on something, in this case Tether, but it's just, you're just recycling FUD narratives, and it's not really, it doesn't really hold any value, because you see the real adoption happening outside of the US, and that kind of like shuts any critic up.
Yeah, like the Tether FUD dice are like, they're like Dungeon and Dragon dice. They're like they're like a big 20-sided one, like that big.
I think we're gonna have like a whole set of different FUD dices in like 5 years from now. Like Bitcoin mining is another FUD dice. Tether, Bitcoin in general is gonna see a lot of. It's very bullish on the dice industry for the coming years.
That's great. So you've alluded a couple of times to kind of like your family history and ties to Argentina. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And is that kind of what got you down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin initially?
So my ties to Argentina is not really, it's pretty non-existent, to be honest. Like apart from like some YouTube videos that I watch just to get like to know what's happening, what people are talking about, it's pretty much non-existent. When I was very little, my mom emigrated from Argentina to Norway, so I pretty much grew up in Oslo. Most of my upbringing was back in Norway, and I went back and forth though, because I had the rest of my family. It was just me and my mom in Oslo, so the rest of my family was in Argentina. So I kept going back, and it was crazy to see the differences. It's just two widely polar opposite, not only geographically but just in terms of how you handle stuff, how things work. And it's very interesting to see kind of like how the Norwegian people are culturally and how they respond to a certain thing, and then compare that to how Argentinians respond to the same thing. So I was always like in between, and that duality of like a super successful, quote unquote, country, small, very rich, got everything, got their shit together, like Norway, versus Argentina, huge country, bunch of people, and everything is chaotic. So the but then starting to contemplate a little bit of like why eventually my dad also emigrated from Argentina in 2001. He went to Spain, and 2001 was just another like just a financial crash that happened, and a lot of Argentinians right now are seeking to leave. So I go to a lot of these Telegram chats, and I see a lot of people with questions on how to emigrate, and I'm thinking, man, uh, I emigrated at the in '89 when I was a kid. Why are these things? Why are people still want to leave Argentina? Why are these things never really getting fixed? So going down, trying to understand that led me to more like Austrian economics, learn about like what hyperinflation is, how it is it's just a monetary phenomenon and nothing else. Started to understand the shit show that is government and control of money. Perfect example was Argentina. So when I got introduced to Bitcoin through a friend of mine who also introduced me to a lot of the Austrian economic theory, it just clicked pretty instantly, and I think that has always been like my main interest with Bitcoin. Apart from the technical stuff, I don't go too deep into that, but more of like the monetary properties of Bitcoin is what really gets me excited and really puts it into perspective, having lived in Argentina and having lived in Norway, and comparing the two.
The kind of Austrian school, I never learned about any of that in school, right? I did a graduate degree, and I never heard about anything about that. And I've talked to other guys since, portfolio managers and guys that ran research departments for sell side brokers and stuff like that. And they just, when you touch on that part of the pitch, their eyes just like, you can tell they've never heard of it either. So I think it's a side of the story that a lot of people have just never even heard. And I think in the current situation, it answers a lot of questions. And also when you put everything in the perspective of history, I think it opens up things a little bit, right? Like the current monetary experiment that we're going through, it doesn't have that much history, right? Things can change. And also when you think about, I often wonder about the differences between Argentina and Canada, right? Because I'm Canadian, used to live in Canada. Two countries that were very similar. In the early 1900s, they were both popular destinations for European immigrants, and I think and both rich in natural resources, um, and they went very different ways. And I think people in places like Canada, they probably don't realize how fragile things are. I wonder to some degree. Maybe they do now. It feels like they're
Yeah.
understanding now.
Yes, exactly. I think that just the fiat experiment is very new. It hasn't been around for that long, and it's just not a sustainable model to begin with. Now, the only thing is the way you kind of like organize the country, and the way the kind of like support citizens gives to government, that gives you an idea of how long it will last. But ultimately, everybody has the same destiny. It's all going down the trash. Fiat is just has no other fate. This has been repeated over and over in ancient history, even. The only difference between in modern history is how fast you get there. So, even though Canada hasn't really acted the way Argentina has acted, you now start to see some of those like indicators that tells you, okay, we are definitely heading down this path, and that was not the case before. But that was just because you thought you were different from Argentina or maybe the
Yeah.
other countries in like the third world. But it's the same. The fiat experiment is the same, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from countries like Argentina, Venezuela. A lot of people look at that and say, "Oh, these are like third world countries. We have nothing in common with them." But honestly, you should look at Venezuela and Argentina as like these people who come from the future to tell you, like what you can expect, and can actually predict how things are going to end. So, with the news of El Salvador passing the legal tender laws, I was kind of like pissed off with a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's just El Salvador. Who cares?" I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from countries like El Salvador and other Latin American, African countries who are going through a lot of the things that Canada and other countries in the West might have to face real soon.
Yeah. Well, the other thing on the El Salvador thing is that there are precedents in history for very small peripheral countries to become economic powerhouses, right? Like you look at Hong Kong and Singapore. Who would have thought 100 years ago, looking at those two countries, that flash forward, they would become, well, I guess Hong Kong used to be an economic powerhouse, but it had a good run. Singapore still is. So, El Salvador could do it as well, right? So it's embracing infrastructure, technology, free markets, that kind of stuff is probably a better path forward than what's been tried in the past.
Yeah, exactly, and it all comes down to the level of freedom that you have. So if you have a high level of economic freedom, then you can have a country like Japan, who is an island of is a big rock in the ocean, no like natural resources per se, very small country, and you can make that one of the top 10 economies of the world just by having free economy. Singapore, Hong Kong, very small states, not a lot of big immigration to begin with, very like had a lot of economical challenges at the very beginning. Just by just upping the freedom, and you will see so much activity, so much trade, so much well-being for the people who live there, that's pretty much what it's all about. You gotta number go up and freedom go up. That's what matters.
Going back to the tether thing on cross-border remittances, do you think that stable coins are kind of like a temporary thing that eventually, because a use case for Bitcoin kind of like 2015, 20, maybe even before that, I guess, was for cross-border remittances. and Tether kind of ate that. Like they just kind of took that away because of the low volatility part of it. Do you think
Yeah.
that's a temporary thing, and then eventually Bitcoin kind of reclaims all that, and Tether and USDC just will probably disappear?
It depends a lot on like the timeline of events. If Bitcoin gets to a place that is somewhat stable, I think it would be preferred by most people. But until like the volatility takes a little chill pill, I think
Yeah.
people are just going to understand stable coins just faster, because it's kind of like the closest reflection to fiat that they have. So all those years of using fiat is going to be a no-brainer for stable coins. But then if Bitcoin, the volatility of Bitcoin is something that you need to unlearn. You need to understand that volatility is because we're very early on in the adoption curve, and that long term, it's a great store of value. But people in these countries who receive the remittances from family members who are working in, like, the West, they have a way shorter time frame to think about. So they are thinking more about short term store of value than long term store of value. But hopefully, when Bitcoin gets to a level where it's somewhat tranquil, I think people will switch.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the end game, right? That's like the hyper Bitcoinization route. Is it eventually it hits like terminal velocity, it gets to a certain size, and volatility really decreases, and then it can be used for a whole other kind of slew of applications. I guess is kind of interesting. So now I'm going to put your feet to the fire a little bit. So we've got some questions from Twitter, and I think it seems like the people on Twitter, like on the previous guests we've had on the podcast, most of the questions focused on kind of like technical questions, and the listeners really saved the heat for you, I think. So question number one, question question number one: why isn't Liquid more popular, Fernando? And what are you personally doing to fix this?
Throughout the different cycles in Bitcoin, a lot of people have um, gotten a collective PTSD from all these token projects. And I think the notion, when you hear about tokens, security tokens, digital assets on top of Bitcoin, I think just that puts a lot of people off. But I think it's more due to just the bad experiences of like these ICO scams or whatever, rather than something that is directly connected to Liquid. I think that in a hyper Bitcoinized future, financial products and services belong on Bitcoin. And I think the same people who talk about a hyper Bitcoinized future, they don't seem to think, second, third, fourth order effects, where in that hyper Bitcoinized world, we're not only going to transact and send Bitcoin to each other. There's going to be economies built on the base layer. So I think it only makes sense that you know financial products and services are on a layer two solution like Liquid, because the same trust minimization that Bitcoin has achieved for central banks, I think needs to happen for the legacy financial system, and it can only happen on Bitcoin. I want to have a future where I can buy equity in a company and know that that equity is on Bitcoin. So I think though that the sentiment is changing. I think a lot of people are starting to understand like the value of that, and therefore understand that it belongs on a layer two solution like Liquid, because it is pegged to Bitcoin. So I think that sentiment is changing and is favorable for Liquid adoption and just the popularity, I guess, of Liquid. The other factor that I think is that Blockstream, the use case that Blockstream has communicated to the world, is a use case that ended up not being very, very popular for people, and not very beneficial. And that was, a use case for high frequency traders who are looking to do some arbitrage between exchanges. And I think it is a definite use case, but I don't think the adoption of that particular use case were successful.
Well, it kind of got co-opted by custodians.
Yeah, exactly. So it was an attempt. I think, looking back, it was an attempt that made sense in that time, but the outcome was not the one that we wanted. But that doesn't mean that Liquid is that there's no other use cases for Liquid. I think the repositioning of Liquid now as the preferred network for having financial products and services like security tokens, like other digital assets, is the correct one. You can see there's a combination of the community sentiment changing and having a deeper understanding of why this is important, versus actual products on Liquid, like the BMN, like the upcoming Volcano bond, actually making it click. So I think the future is extremely bright for Liquid, and I think this particular use case is just a matter of a repositioning from a marketing perspective, a repositioning and an update of the messaging to connect the institutional investors, the global investors who want to partake in a future like this. That should be done on Liquid, and I think we got to connect the message and the audience and make it click.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think I would also add too, in that we there's no token on the back of Liquid, right? We didn't issue an ICO or anything like that. So I think that's probably a short-term weakness, but a long-term advantage, right? It's a short-term weakness because there's a lot of pay to play in this industry. And if you're defining popularity as integration on exchanges, custodians, wallets, typically there's fees involved in that. And I think that probably worked against Liquid in the short term, but I think longer term for the bigger game for security tokens, the tokenization of capital markets, that's something where if you've got a spivvy token out there in your closet, I don't think that's going to fly as well. So I think it probably positions us better in the future to integrate with kind of larger players, and I think in a market that's massively ripe for disruption.
Yeah, exactly, and that is something that we need to work on and educate people and make them understand the trade-off of like the pure decentralization, let's say, of the Bitcoin base layer versus the federated model that we have in Liquid, and why it's good, why it's actually better than, I don't know, uh, other projects claiming to be a Bitcoin project which have their own shitcoin. So it doesn't make sense to do that. But I think a lot of people will understand. It's up to us. It's our responsibility to educate the people and telling them how things work.
Great. So what are some big Blockstream kind of milestones that you're looking forward to us hitting this year?
I think one of the big Blockstream milestones that I foresee in 2022 is further adoption of our green wallet. I think the team behind the Green Wallet is extremely talented, and there's so many features. It's something for everyone when it comes to green. So I'm really looking forward to just talk about these features, present the benefits, bring people closer in to the many ways that you can use green. I think also we have a lot of work to do when it comes to Liquid adoption, and I think BMN is at the forefront of being the prime example of how far you can take, a tokenized project. So I'm really looking forward to just have more tranches and just bring more people in to the BMN ecosystem, because I think it's an excellent primer to understand and really grok the Liquid network and what it can do for people who want to build on Liquid. And that's the two things that I think is going to make the biggest splashes for Blockstream in 2022.
All right, good stuff. Last question: what in Bitcoin in 2022 gets you most excited? What are you looking forward to seeing develop in Bitcoin in the next 12 months or so?
Maybe it's not like technically related to Bitcoin, but I'm really looking forward to see just the macro environment. How, like, what are other sovereign nation states that are going to adopt Bitcoin, and see where in the world those nation states are going to come from. I think the first domino has just fallen in the macro perspective. So I'm really looking forward to see how this will play out in 2022. I think even though I'm not the biggest fan of governments, I think that just making Bitcoin not illegal, and so that more normal people can actually look at Bitcoin and not be scared and not have huge objections, I think is a very important thing for Bitcoin as a whole, and for the road to mass adoption. So really looking forward to just have a finger on the pulse on that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for taking the time today to talk to us, Fernando.
I appreciate the talk, buddy. Thank you.
All right, take care.
All right, bye.